Hi, everyone. Time for an update on some of the episodes we're working on so that you can submit your always great questions. So, first up, we're planning an episode on boomer moms. This is going to be a complicated one. It's basically about what possibilities were and weren't available to our boomer moms. How are we thinking about this differently as we reach the age when our boomer moms were parenting us? Things that boomer moms are good or bad at. We can also, I would love some questions from boomer moms as well. So this is going to be a really complicated and really good episode, and I can't wait. We also have a fun one in the works about heartthrobs in 2026. So who are our heartthrobs? Who gets to be a heartthrob? How do they get to be one? What's the road? What do they look like? I mean, we can take this in so many directions. We've also heard from a lot of listeners that they want an episode about AI, and I'm like, fine. So we're going to talk about the intersection of AI and creativity and writing specifically with the author of one of my favorite books from last year, Vahini Vara. And just FYI, we keep a running list of what we're working on in the show notes, so you can always look there if you want to know what's coming up. And as always, thank you so much for your smart and thoughtful questions. You all are what make this show so fun. And our co-hosts always remark on how smart you are, so keep up the good work. And just FYI, this episode was recorded before the war in Iran, so we talk a lot about some of the things that the government is doing with our tax dollars, but if you're wondering why we do not mention the war, that's why. This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I'm Ruth Braunstein. I am SNF Agora Institute Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University and the author of My Tax Dollars, The Morality of Taxpaying in America.
Ruth, you have such an interesting intersection of interests, scholarly interests. It's right at taxpaying, morality, but also evangelical Christians. There's just so much going on. How did you get interested in this particular intersection?
Oh, yeah. It's not just an average set of interests that everybody has. I assumed everyone was interested in this stuff.
Yeah. I am. So, yes.
I think we all are at some level. I've been studying religion and politics in the United States for a long time. And, it's a topic that I decided to focus on, at some point when I decided to go back to graduate school. But really, it was something that had interested me my whole life. And I grew up in the South where, religion is just really a big part of everyday life in a way that it maybe isn't as true in a place like New York City or other places in the country. And I wasn't necessarily a part of that religious culture. So I grew up in an interfaith family of Jews and Catholics from the North, and always found, the community that I lived in to be incredibly welcoming. I had a great supportive childhood, but I always was able to kind of observe it as a kind of insider-outsider.
Yep.
And I came away with so many questions that I realized I needed to basically spend the rest of my life trying to answer.
Absolutely. So your new book is about how taxes became a moral battleground in the U.S., and there's so much fascinating history going on with this as well. And obviously people should read it, but also what are some of the big, what are the touchstones when you talk to people, undergrads especially, or someone who's just curious about your research and wants to go beyond the elevator talk? What are the moments that you point to that are definitive or really profoundly shaped how we think about taxes and morality?
Yeah, I don't even think we need to point to a specific historical moment. We can just think about American culture in general. And I like to think of American culture as one that is always doing a kind of push and pull tug of war between different impulses. One of those impulses is a deep commitment to pluralism. We are a country that was born out of a desire for lots of different groups of people to be able to just come here and live their lives. And sometimes that takes the form of religious pluralism, meaning, people of different kinds of religious beliefs and values being free to practice their faith. But it also involves other kinds of sort of value pluralism, ideological pluralism. We have a lot of disagreements in our country, and we all need to figure out a way to live together. But we also, despite that commitment to pluralism, are a very individualistic culture.
Yes.
And we are deeply committed to the idea that as individuals, we have both a right and a responsibility to kind of protect our own interests and our own thriving. And the unit of analysis for Americans is so often the individual rather than the community. And so that's a real tension, to be committed to both individualism and pluralism, and then also to be as diverse and large a society as we are. And so those are questions that always come up in my work, and just every project I've ever worked on comes down to that sort of tug of war. And there's really no issue I can think of that crystallizes some of the tensions that creates more than when we talk about taxes.
I also think, and just because of when we're recording this episode, when we're talking about this, like when people gesture to the degradation of our societal fabric in the United States right now, it seems to me that they are talking a little bit about a failure to keep those ideals of pluralism and individualism in tension. Some people think we have gone too far to one side of tolerating pluralism, and some people think that we have gone too far in terms of individualism. But I also think, and this is the hard thing always for me when I'm trying to understand fierce individualism, is that I could understand it in as it's manifest in like the libertarians where I grew up in rural Idaho, who really are like, not only do I want freedom from taxes that ask me to pay for things that don't benefit me, but I also don't care what you do in your home, right? Like they legitimately thought like you can practice whatever religion you want, you can have sex with whoever you want, you can smoke marijuana, right? But that tolerance of difference, like that tolerance of other individuals' actions, it's like, I want to be able to do whatever I want to do, but I also want everyone else to do what I want to do too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of anarchistic strain that we see run from the far left to the far right
Yeah.
that would say that everyone should just be allowed to do whatever they want to do without interference from the state or from other kinds of institutions, including religion. And even though some of the current administration is inflected with some libertarian ideas about taxes and small government, there's, the rest of the agenda, right, is a very far cry from a live and let live kind of ethos. It's really much more aligned with a kind of Christian nationalist desire to create a society that is built around a single religious ideal and to prioritize the people and the ideas that are part of that in-group. And that's really not libertarian.
No.
And so it's interesting, I wrote about, the far-right anti-tax movement, and it's really a place where these kind of Christian nationalist ideas and these libertarian ideas get fused historically and start to make sense sort of for a lot of people on the right as being connected in a way that logically they're kind of not.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, how does it come to make sense? Like, because I think this is really important. I think sometimes people, when people espouse beliefs that are very foreign to them, they're like, well, this just is totally nonsensical. But when someone believes something that fiercely, they have come to make it make sense to them. And underlining the ways in which that process happens is so important. So I would love to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues is that when the far right today, or the right more generally, talks about resisting the state and resisting big government and resisting all the obligations that come with being a citizen of a country that is run by democratic institutions, it's largely resisting the version of the state that they view as serving people outside their in-group.
Yeah.
And so it's actually not resisting all the different ways that government is serving the in-group and the interests of the in-group. And so when you talk to folks who are kind of see themselves as anti-statist, but also imagine themselves as trying to defend a particular vision of a Christian nation, there is a huge support for state interference with people's lives in order to, in their view, protect the Christian nation or promote its values. And so there's just this very clear sense that I'm for the state when it's for my group, and I'm against the state when it's for others.
And I also think that when we talk about in-group, out-group, what sometimes that gets mapped onto like a feeling of like, I'm a valid American. I'm a real American, right?
Yes.
And the people in the out group are actually not Americans, and thus their rights don't count.
Absolutely. And in the context of a lot of these debates about tax paying, the real American category gets mapped onto a taxpayer category. Right. And so there's this idea that, oh, I'm a taxpayer and those other people out there are not real taxpayers or are not paying as much as me or are, kind of these drags on the system.
Right.
That, I'm paying in and they're taking.
Right.
And the idea of dividing the society into payers and takers is very sort of central to a kind of modern libertarianism that comes out of Ayn Rand and, this sense that there's this creator class that is supporting society and everyone else is just trying to take from it.
And I always, the fault lines always become so visible when, you point out that undocumented people pay taxes, right?
So much taxes. And don't actually get to
don't get the benefits
from it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we've already gotten into some of the feelings that we have about taxes, but this episode is about other people's feelings as well. When you emailed me about potentially doing this episode, I was like, absolutely. This is I always want to talk about taxes and our feelings about taxes and how do we talk to other people about paying taxes, because the rhetoric around taxes and why they matter is very important. But I also think sometimes this is part of what I like about your work. Sometimes people on both sides of the political spectrum, and I'm in self-indicting here, we don't make space for the frustrations that we have with what our tax dollars are doing and how we're wielding them. And your work really engages with that. So that's part of the reason that I wanted to have you on. But we got fantastic questions from listeners. We always have great questions, but I think they're very good this time, and I'm excited to go through them. So, okay, this first one comes from Zoe, and Melody's going to read it.
Why are Americans so weird about lower income folks taking advantage of government loopholes, but not the ultra wealthy? For example, I often hear about people underreporting their income to qualify for food stamps or Medicaid, which is also very rare, spoken about with derision, while rich folks avoiding taxes and whatever else they do is being smart.
We kind of teed a little bit of this up, but where would you take this first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just so important to step back and recognize how much Americans today just really revere wealth and wealthy people and make assumptions about them and their worth and their merit and the fact that they must have had, valuable skills and qualities in order to achieve their wealth and status that allows us to give them a pass or assume the best intentions that they might have. And then we have the opposite impression of people who are low income, which is that they are less skilled, don't try as hard, less intelligent, less worthy. And so because we sort of make assumptions about people's worth and trustworthiness based on the amount of money they have, it makes it really easy to see why there's this inherent distrust of, low-income people trying to kind of cheat the system, right? Because it fits that broader stereotype. And a sense that, well, if wealthy people are going out of their way to avoid taxes, they're just working within the existing system.
Yep.
And so blame the system, not them. Or they're just smart. And that's actually how they got ahead in the first place, is that they understood how to work the system and profit from it. And so you're right. It's a complete double standard. And the amount of money that is sort of the amount of what's called the tax gap, the amount of taxes that are not collected, that are owed, that is due to wealthy people avoiding taxes, just absolutely is like a mountain compared to a couple grains of sand from low-income people occasionally, fudging their taxes, which is rare. And so, it's completely misplaced priorities.
How much do you think this is connected to the resilience of the tenets of meritocracy and the persistence of the American dream as a guiding ideology, and the idea the corresponding idea that if you are rich, you are somehow morally successful, right? Like a rich person is doing things right and a poor person is doing things wrong. Like I know we have sometimes like these almost like a beatification of like the poor and the struggling who are like heads down doing their jobs as laborers. But I actually think that that is almost like as we moved away from like valorizing labor and moved towards valorizing the accumulation of wealth, like the positive moral balance is almost transferred to the ultra wealthy, but in a complicated way.
Absolutely. And in a way that has become, where there used to be some kind of reverence for the very wealthy, particularly in the sense that they were viewed as like pillars in the community and job creators.
Yeah.
But there was also a sense of not wanting to be too conspicuous about one's wealth, right? In order to maintain that kind of high moral status.
Right.
That's gone today, right? Conspicuous consumption is in, right? Actually showing that you have sharp elbows and kind of get to the top in ways that are a little bit sneaky are in. And the idea is that you're just smarter. It's like a kind of state of nature that if you were able to succeed in this kind of wild west of capitalism, then you are to be revered. And that if you can't succeed, then you are weak. And so, the sense that wealth would come with any kind of moral obligation back to your community as sort of a contingency of being viewed in high moral regard is really kind of old-fashioned at this point.
Right.
And I do think that shapes how people see this in our willingness to excuse things like tax avoidance. And I have to say that like one of the big turning points was Donald Trump on the debate stage sort of saying like, of course I don't pay I don't pay any more taxes than I can get away with, right? That's just smart.
Right.
And people thought this would be a scandal. It was not. But that's the kind of thing that can really chip away at Americans' sense that, everybody should pay their fair share because, it replaces that with a sense of everybody should pay as little as they can get away with.
Yeah. Even that idea, right? Like people thought it was going to be a scandal and it was not. When I think about scandal theory, which is something I've thought about a lot with celebrities and how something becomes a scandal or it doesn't, to me with Trump, what that underlines is that it wasn't just that statement reset the values. It's that the values had been reset so thoroughly that when he uttered that speech act, it was channeling what we already believed instead of like resetting them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that so much of Trump was just recognizing that sort of the ground had shifted in our society, and he gave permission for people to articulate things that they just hadn't felt comfortable articulating before. And so part of social change is sort of making things thinkable than making them doable,
right?
Without social sanction. And he was kind of a part of doing both of those things. But the underlying desire for that was already there.
And that's why his long lineage is so instructive too, right? Because it's like at his career as a celebrity and all of his bankruptcies and like all of his crass doings, like all of it, right? Like he's a bad businessman who becomes a good businessman through like manipulating the system. But no one's like, oh, Trump is so good at business. I don't like, how do you make sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the ways that he has always made money
have
not been through like the fundamentals of business, but have been through grift.
Yeah.
Right. But he's made being a grifter actually seem like a form of success.
Yeah.
And so I think that's again part of this like, well, cheating on your taxes is part of that, maybe. And this is such a slippery slope. I mean, so I think that for people who maybe haven't really thought about how our tax system works, I will do a 2-minute kind of 101,
please.
Might surprise people. So as much as Americans complain about paying their taxes, the United States actually has one of the highest what's called tax morales in the world, meaning people's general sense that the system is legitimate and our voluntary compliance with it. So compared to like other places where like no one pays their taxes, right? People in the United States overwhelmingly pay their taxes. And that's partly because of how the system is set up, where a lot of our taxes are withheld from our paychecks and other kinds of things like that. But also because generally Americans think that to be a good citizen, you pay your taxes, and it is bad to evade paying your taxes. Like there's huge amounts of consensus on this, which is not common for there to be consensus on these kinds of questions.
Yeah.
But, and this is the part where it gets slippery, tax morale generally rests on sort of a couple of things happening. One is that people continue to believe that the system is legitimate and fair, meaning that the burdens are being spread reasonably fairly across society.
Yeah.
They also believe that if they voluntarily comply, meaning they submit their tax return and pay their taxes on time, that people who don't will be punished. Right? That like there will be enforcement of this. So that, because no one wants to feel like a sucker, like they're doing the right thing, but their neighbor's not, and their neighbor gets away with it. Because once you start thinking that's true, then you stop. And right, we're seeing an erosion of the enforcement side. There's been huge amounts of sort of workforce declines at the IRS. I was listening this morning to NPR that people are like not able to get anyone on the phone. Paperwork is backing up. And so, you know, once the enforcement side goes away, people are going to start being like, well, why am I going to pay?
Right.
If, like,
I'm the sucker who's paying the full taxes. I feel like part of this too, and you allude to this, is also this feeling of surveillance. Like there was a feeling for me growing up that if you didn't pay your taxes, then you would be audited. And auditing was a big, scary, bad thing. But now that I've been personally audited, it's actually not that big and scary. Like it's just like, oh, can we double check some figures? Like, but that sense of surveillance and that like you would be found out as doing something morally wrong, like there's something even about like the look of the IRS envelope that feels like I've been bad.
Absolutely.
That's regimenting people into a certain type of behavior. And I think you're totally right. It's eroding.
Yeah. I mean, I've never heard of a letter causing more fear, you know, like automated letters that just strike fear in the heart of Americans.
Yes. The Culture Study podcast is sponsored by Blissy. So the other day I went in to get my 6-week maintenance haircut. I have to get my hair cut like every 6 to 8 weeks because it's so fine and thin that like it falls apart if I don't have regular upkeep. And my hairstylist was like, oh, wow, like what are you doing to help with your frizz? And I was like, oh, I have a Blissy pillowcase. And it really has helped. It's helped a lot. My hair tends towards frizz, and you know, switching my pillowcase to Blissy has been really helpful in lessening that frizz. Also, I'll admit that using better rubber bands when I put my hair into a ponytail also helps. Blissy pillowcases are made of silk, not cotton, not satin. Satin is totally different, even though in my head I always group them together. And silk is so helpful with not only decreasing frizz, but also with making your face less prone to break out. It's just cleaner. Silk is also natural and cooling. If, like me, you love the feel of cool pillowcase, like this is the way. You'll never go back. It's also fully machine washable and is a perfect gift for like that person that you never know what to get something for. It's very luxurious. Because you're a listener, Blissy is offering 60 nights risk-free plus an additional 30% off when you shop at blissy.com/culturepod. That's BLISSY.com/culturepod and use code culturepod to get an additional 30% off. Your skin and hair will thank you. Today's episode is sponsored by OneSkin. The other day, I ran out of moisturizer and I actually bought some OneSkin, because usually we get it in the mail just as like promotional stuff, but I didn't want to deal with like bothering people. And I was like, this has become so much of my routine that I just bought the moisturizer. That's how much I love it. My favorite OneSkin product is just the like basic facial moisturizer. It doesn't have any smells. It goes on really seamlessly. It doesn't feel oily. It's a great replacement if you have like a super complicated routine, or if you have no routine at all and you want just some basic moisturizer and want to get started with one. I also love the under eye cream and use that as part of my routine every day. The thing that makes OneSkin so good is their patented OS1 peptide, the first ingredient proven to target senescent cells, a key driver of wrinkles, fine lines, loss of elasticity, and these results have been validated in 4 different peer-reviewed clinical studies. OneSkin is also certified safe for sensitive skin. It's part of why I love it, and it's free from 1,500 harsh or irritating ingredients. It's dermatologist tested and has been awarded the National Eczema Association Seal of Acceptance. Born from over a decade of longevity research, OneSkin's OS1 peptide is proven to target the visible signs of aging, helping you to unlock your healthiest skin now and as you age. For a limited time, try OneSkin with 15% off using code CULTURE at oneskin.co/culture. That's 15% off oneskin.co with code CULTURE. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support the show and tell them that we sent you. No, this all makes total sense. And also that we're in, inflection point is the wrong word for it because I think it's like a prolonged inflection point. Do you think that that's true?
I do. I think it's one inflection point. I don't think it's necessarily the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
The country has gone through lots of ups and downs in this kind of way before. And, we still see really robust support for the idea that being a good citizen requires paying taxes.
Yeah.
And so, I think that the debates that we have about tax paying, as I write about, are partly about taxes, but they're also partly these sort of spaces where we have much bigger debates about what kind of a society we want to be and how we want to be connected to one another, what we owe one another, how we feel like it's appropriate to be governed. And sometimes the answers that we come up with don't involve tax paying. And so, one of the things, the book is called My Tax Dollars, The Morality of Tax Paying in America. And sometimes people think that I'm making a kind of positive moral case for tax paying, which I kind of am, but I also kind of explore the kind of moral reasoning that people bring to supporting other kinds of arrangements that involve supporting each other with their money. And sometimes these can go together. And so sometimes that means mutual aid. Sometimes that means supporting charitable organizations. Sometimes that means creating, a different kind of system where a community is able to share resources and distribute those to those who need it. And so tax paying and the tax system that we have today is the most kind of efficient and fair way of sharing collective resources while kind of working within a democratic process that anyone has been able to come up with. But it's a tool, and it's a tool to solve a problem. And there's often other solutions to those problems at more local scales.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I did a lot of research into how immigrant mutual aid societies in the 19th century functioned, when essentially the social safety net as we now understand it, or as it was understood at the height of its strength, was not functioning for these new immigrants to the United States, at least not in the ways that they felt they could access. And so they would get together, and then part of their dues was paying so that, okay, if I'm killed on my job, which was much more common back then my widow would be taken care of. It's like life insurance, effectively. And people formed those alliances and participated in those mutual aid pay-ins because the tax system was not providing the civilization that they needed in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super interesting.
Yeah, and I think that, our current tax system, I don't think anybody would sit here and say it's perfect and we should defend it with all our power. I think that the tax system is kind of the accumulation of a bunch of solutions to problems that presented themselves over the past, 100 or so years. And so it's not perfect. But to say that, we want to throw it away is also to say, well, we have to solve those problems in other ways.
Seriously, how would you pay for roads?
Right.
Who would repair the old ass bridge that's about to fall down? All of these are problems, right? That we can't solve hodgepodge. We're at a level of scale that demands this sort of combining of resources.
Absolutely. And, I think that one of the reasons why a tax system as opposed to just, okay, let's set up a society where everybody donates what they want to whatever they want, whatever level they want, right? This is the kind of like libertarian
No one's
fantasy.
donating to the sewage system.
No one is donating to the sewage system. And, and this is partly based on how people, we know, right, that people generally are short-termist in their thinking and reasonably self-interested. And by self, I mean partly me, myself as an individual, then maybe my family, and then maybe people I like, right? Like we're mostly sort of thinking like that in terms of—
And who live like I do. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that there's reasons that people might not naturally be thinking of supporting things that need to be supported that actually do benefit them, but are not in their short-term interest. So when we're setting up a tax system, we're thinking long-term, right? So we're thinking not just about me today, but me in 10 years and my kids in 100 years, right? Mm-hmm. We're thinking about kind of how we connect to other communities in ways that, again, may not be evident to us in our like immediate lives, but matter. And we're setting up these broader systems that nobody would necessarily think to pay for themselves. Yeah. But at the same time, I do think that there's space to look at our tax system and say, well, where are places that maybe communities could solve some of these problems better on their own? Or charitable organizations could solve some of these problems better on their own, or whatever it might look like. Fee-for-service could solve this problem better. And so I think there's always space for having those big conversations and not being sort of so attached to this existing system, which is, of course, the product of all kinds of like negotiations.
And we'll get later in the show onto like different feelings about different levels of taxation in terms of like local, state, federal, and how those monies are allocated. But next we have a question that I love that's about age and outlook on taxes. This comes from Erica.
I'm an estate planning attorney in Portland, Oregon, and I've noticed this. Baby boomer clients, even very progressive ones, have an almost visceral aversion to paying estate tax. As a side note, not all states have an estate tax, and in my opinion, estate taxes are effective and progressive. Gen X clients and younger are more open to me asking how big a priority tax avoidance is in their planning. Anecdotally, among my generally liberal and progressive clients in a state that needs the revenue badly, older folks just don't want to pay. What's this about? Is it different in other parts of the country? Is this a United States thing?
The estate tax is so fascinating. Okay, can you tell us more about how we came up with the idea of an estate tax and then what you think is happening in terms of age here?
Sure. And I mean, I now want to do an entire project just talking to older people about the estate tax because this is fascinating. And so I don't have a perfect answer to the actual question. But, I do always like to remind my students and other people when I'm talking about this that when you set up a society, like if you were to draw a society on a piece of paper from scratch and say, I want it organized this way, you are making a set of choices about how resources will be passed to one generation to the next that are really important. And so you could have a setup where when people die, all of their property goes to some sort of like central repository and gets redistributed out. Or you could have a system where when people die, all of their property goes to their children and stays in their family and allows their family to accumulate wealth over generations. And our society is very close to the latter, where, we essentially say, again, because our unit of analysis in the United States is basically the individual and the family, we say what you earned is yours and your children's. And what that has meant is that wealth has like snowballed over generations, particularly for families who had wealth early in the 20th century. And those who didn't have access to those resources. And so what the estate tax does is it's an effort to kind of find a middle ground between those two, where it says, okay, the vast majority of your property can be passed to your children as like your legacy, et cetera. But some of it is going to go back to a kind of communal pot that will be used to be redistributed in a variety of ways. And this is perceived by some Americans as essentially a fully communist, statist solution. And I think that part of what they're not recognizing is how much further you could go, right?
Right.
And that's just a decision that a society has made. And so,
Right.
the estate tax is essentially that, upon death, part of your estate is taxed. And, I think that this is something that feels really abstract to young people because nobody's thinking about nobody's imagining that they might have a lot of wealth unless they're born very wealthy. And they're probably not doing that kind of estate planning. But as you get older, because money is such this fundamental, foundational part of our identity as individuals and as Americans, my sense is that people come to see the resources that they have accumulated over the course of their life as the legacy that they leave for the next generation and as something that they're able to give to their children, and that it feels actually like something very personal being taken away from them, like their life's work.
Yes.
And so, that's without having talked to all these folks in different places, my sense, just based on how we do think about our identity in relation to money, would say that that's part of what's happening at that stage of life.
Okay, I have a theory, but first I want to have a quick side note just to define what we mean when we say that something is a progressive tax. Because I think I thought for a long time that just meant like it's a leftist tax, which it is to some extent, but it also has a particular meaning in terms of how it functions. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So often when we think of a progressive tax, it gets contrasted to a flat tax. So a flat tax would mean every single person pays the exact same tax rate. So think of a tithe, right, where everyone would pay 10% of their income for taxes, which seems very fair, except for the fact that for people who are sort of low income, 10% of their income is a huge proportion for them of what they need to survive. And because they don't have as much cushion. They don't have as much extra. And so what a progressive tax says is that as you are wealthier, you pay a progressively higher proportion of your income in this case in taxes. And it's partly resting on the premise that as you are wealthier, you're not using 100% of your income in order to survive. And so you have more cushion to survive. And we know generally that especially as people have gotten way, way wealthier, right, that they're essentially hoarding cash, that there is no way in their lifetime they could spend the amount of cash that they have. And so, the idea is that we should be thinking first about what do people need to survive, then what do people need in order to live what we would consider kind of a good life. And then beyond that, that's kind of like icing on the cake that shouldn't necessarily be protected by the state in the public interest.
Yeah. And the way I also think of it is like taxing as a way to bring more people to like a median point at like a healthy middle.
Yep.
And it's no mistake in my mind that like when we had the highest percentage of income tax on the rich was also like coincided with the golden age of capitalism and the robust rise of the middle class and all of those different things, right? And now as we continue to think of like progressive taxes as somehow evil, we also have like great wealth disparity and that sort of thing.
Massive, massive wealth inequality that has corresponded pretty much directly with the decline of the highest marginal tax rate. And I think that people sometimes don't realize this because we're having, we have these like knockdown, drag out fights about the tax rate. And it's a question of whether it'll be like 30% or 35%. But like, during the middle of the 20th century, it was like 90-something percent.
Yes. Like there was no reason to be rich.
No.
Like that's what's so fascinating to me. I first encountered this when I was learning about star salaries, like Hollywood star salaries. They were like, well, it doesn't matter if I get paid more because it's just going to go to taxes. It's so cool.
Yeah. I mean, so like there was this perspective that if you made over $1 million at that time, right, which was basically $1 billion today, right? Like not, that's not actual math, but, just like a huge amount of money, that you basically all of that, everything you made over $1 million should be taxed because there was just no need for anyone to have that much money. And, this was obviously, there was a big debate about this, as you might imagine, but the debate was like, should it be 95% or 93%? Like that was the terms of the debate. And the wild thing, and one of the reasons why I constantly am like, the tax debates are not just about tax rates, is that our kind of the anti-tax movement in this country has only gotten stronger as those tax rates have fallen.
Right?
right? So you would think you wouldn't need as strong a movement if it's going from 90% to 30%.
So interesting.
And yet it's
so interesting.
yeah, so there's something bigger going on.
So quickly, my theory about why people as they age get more anxious about paying taxes. I think that we have such a poor Social Security net, and Social Security has failed to. Social Security no longer on its own provides a living situation for most people as they age and as they retire. And the disappearance of the pension, it's basically a very fraught and precarious moment for a lot of elderly people. And so even if they have a lot of money, they are still terrified that they're going to run out of it.
Yeah.
And some of this is healthcare costs and escalating healthcare costs. Some of this is like the fear that like if they go into a nursing home, it's just going to take all of their money, right? And this is, I mean, there are a lot of different strategies in order to make it so that no, your entire, like all of the money that you have amassed does not get allocated to that. And I think if we had a more robust retirement safety net, and that includes universal health care, we kind of do, but like Medicare is just now shot through with all sorts of holes and like actually very expensive in different ways if you have to get supplemental plans and that sort of thing. That some of it is about passing down wealth, but a lot of it is like, what if I live to 95?
Absolutely.
I have to hoard this.
Of course. I mean, because you could live to 100.
Yeah.
Like this was unforeseen that people could live so long with a reasonably high quality of life. And I think you're right that the volatility of the current system that makes it so hard to know that like in 20 years, will there be Medicare? In 20 years, will there be Social Security? I mean, I think that Social Security, there's less of a question about, but especially with our healthcare system, it feels like pricing is so opaque. It's so unpredictable. We know that most Americans are one healthcare crisis away from being in debt. And, it just, I think you're right that it creates so much anxiety. And so there maybe just is this impulse to keep as much as you can on hand.
And I will be very surprised if millennials don't age into this demographic and are also incredibly averse to taxes because we are conditioned to precarity through just everything that we've been through.
Yeah.
The Culture City podcast is sponsored by Lola Blankets. So it's April 14th when we're recording this ad. We are supposedly in spring. But did you know that every night I fall asleep with like 3 blankets on top of me because it's still freaking freezing here in the Pacific Northwest? There's going to be like a ton of snow in the mountains. There's a frost warning. I mean, spring is not arriving. I am so happy to have my Lola blanket to keep me cozy. Also, my dogs are still like absolutely cuddling on it at every moment, which is what underlines to me that it is still actually winter, not spring. Lola is the world's #1 blanket, crafted with ultra-soft luxury faux fur and a signature 4-way stretch that sets it apart. It is the #1 most desirable object in my entire home. I have things that cost so much more. I have things that are ostensibly so much fancier, but all anyone wants when they come over, they just want to sit with the Lola. I just washed mine the other day. It's double hemmed for durability. There's no fraying. There's no broken stitches. It looks flawless. There's no pilling. And there's no shedding, which is huge, even after repeated washes. I have the large, which is perfect for me and myself and maybe battling for a corner of it with the dog. Melody has the extra large, which was the right choice. And I wish that I had that. There's a reason they call it the biggest blanket on the internet. They also make weighted blankets for calming therapeutic vibes and also matching pillows, which I covet tremendously. For a limited time, our listeners can get 40% off select Lola blanket products with code CULTURE at checkout. Just head to lolablankets.com and use code CULTURE to get 40% off your order. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and let them know that we sent you. I don't know, send me a pic of you with your Lola blanket. It'll be amazing. Wrap yourself in luxury with Lola blankets. Okay, next question. Also love this question. It comes from Jennifer, and Melody's going to read it.
I have always felt that charitable donations should not be tax deductible and never claim them or deduct them on my taxes, because it defeats the purpose of making a contribution to then reap a tax benefit in exchange. My question is, would charitable giving really decline in the absence of tax deductions?
So we have evidence about this, right? Over the last couple of years.
We do.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to say that I love that this person is like personally sticking to their values and not claiming this tax credit. And I hope there's lots of people out there like you who are really trying to kind of put their money where their mouth is. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's different ways to think about what the tax benefit of charitable donations is. And one of those ways is, I think, similar to what the person asking this question is thinking, that it's somewhat cynical, that like, oh, I'm going to give to charity and get a big tax benefit. Mm-hmm. The other way of thinking about it is that it actually makes your charitable donation cheaper. And therefore, you're able to give more for essentially the same price, right? Because you're getting a slight discount on your taxes the more you give. And so I think for particularly people who are giving larger charitable donations, they're building in the assumed tax benefit to their overall gift size, and it is allowing them to give a little bit more of that gift. And so I think that there's those different ways to think about it. You can also think about it as a bit of a kind of behavioral nudge, right? So if we give people a tax break for donating to charity, is that like just the teensiest extra incentive that they needed to donate that money to charity? And so for a long time, the assumption was that it was working as that kind of behavioral nudge or incentive. Now, as you mentioned, in 2017, when most individuals, the sort of standard deduction that most individuals could take was increased, far beyond what most people were going to donate to charity. And so most people stopped itemizing their deductions, which would include a lot of charitable deductions. And the question was, is this going to lead to a massive decline in the amount that people donate to charity? The answer to that is a little bit complicated, because what it did lead to was a massive decline in the amount of charitable donations that people reported on their tax returns.
Yeah.
Of course, because you don't need to itemize them.
I stopped itemizing. Exactly. Yeah.
Right? So that's not surprising. But there is some data to suggest that the actual amount of money raised by charities was basically flat to a little bit up. Now, there's a lot of noise in that data. We had COVID, for example, in the middle, where people had a lot more income and there was a lot more need. And so I think we need to wait a little bit longer to see how that shakes out. But my overall take on this is that that tax incentive to give to charity was sort of one little nudge, right? But there's lots of other reasons that people want to give to charity. And it's not just for the tax benefit.
What's the genesis of the deduction? Because to me, it seems like a classic example of this idea that like we should be in private-public partnership in order like to take care of one another.
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things about the sort of creation of our modern tax system is that it was not necessarily built as a permanent tax system. It was built during World War I and then expanded during World War II as a way to raise money during the war. And then they kind of kept it. And so again, like it was a solution to a problem that became a permanent feature of our political life and our political institutions. And during that time, when there was this need to create this mass income tax to raise money for the war, there was also concern that people who were being taxed at high rates would stop giving money to charitable organizations. And the United States has always had a really robust sort of civic sector or third sector, meaning a place where people are self-organizing through civic organizations and charities and other kinds of things in their communities outside of government. And so suddenly the government was going to be taking a bunch of money that would be used in ways that were creating these sort of collective resources in the form of the military, but they still wanted to incentivize donations to those charitable organizations. And so this was the kind of compromise for that.
Yeah.
And, I think that most people who think about the tax system would say that sort of it is very healthy for our democracy to have this robust civic sector, where people are able to self-organize and money is able to flow in ways that aren't necessarily sort of channeled through the federal government. It gives communities autonomy. It allows for communities to sort of observe, their own rituals and advance their own values. And so, having both of those in balance is, I think, worth thinking about doing. But this was the solution to that.
I feel like I could talk about this for an entire additional episode, including I feel a very strong movement, at least that I've seen on in people with similar political persuasions, to stop tax exempt status for religious organizations. When, as you point out, a lot of those religious organizations, the reason they're able to do the work that they're doing is because of that tax exempt status. But then they're also, with that charitable work, there's also the ideological components.
Absolutely.
And is that just part of the tacit agreement that we make in our particular society?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that part of going back to this idea that, in a pluralistic society that has a lot of diversity of religious ideals and commitments and values, and also other kinds of, ethnic groups that want to preserve their heritage and, just lots of diversity and difference, that in a pluralistic utopia, all of that gets respected. A lot of these civil society organizations are designed to advance these smaller scale communities' goals. And so on one hand, we can think of those as being beautiful and sort of a necessary part of a pluralistic society to allow people to live their, in their particular kind of community, organized around their particular set of values. At the same time, sometimes those infringe on other people's values. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes, something that has to be negotiated in practice. It also, some people would criticize this as sort of encouraging in-group bonding at the expense of kind of cross-group bridging. And, I think that there's a place for both of those things, that, one isn't necessarily better than the other. But if you only are doing one, right, if you're only bridging across differences, you might lose some of your cultural kind of distinctiveness. That might be important for your family, right? You could lose language or religion or whatever. And if you're only doing bonding, right, with your in-group, then of course you're isolating yourselves from others, and there's not that kind of mutual learning and knitting together of communities into this broader society.
The other thing it makes me think of is that if we do collectively believe that there are some things that cannot turn a profit, and if we try to make them turn a profit, they become incredibly exploitative and provide poor services. Religions are one of them. If we had every church, synagogue, mosque paying property taxes, they would not, most likely they would not be able to function and provide the services that they do, right? The same for so many educational institutions and health nonprofits and that sort of thing. And so when we take away the nonprofit status, you render them into profit-seeking entities. And that leads us down a whole another path, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It does. I think that, particularly with the question of religion, there's a lot of tensions that are intrinsic in kind of slotting religious institutions into this framework that is designed for other kinds of nonprofit organizations like hospitals and educational institutions, in part because, yes, there is a public good that can be identified that comes from supporting healthy and thriving religious institutions, particularly because they do often take on all these other responsibilities in a community, from providing social services to providing, communities and networks for people and social support, right? There's all kinds of things that religious institutions are doing, and we now are becoming really aware of that in places where those institutions are dying because people lack that kind of social connectivity. But it's a direct form of entanglement in religion by the state. And so, right, it creates a mode of controlling religious institutions that I think many of them would struggle with whether to make that bargain today. And so it raises all kinds of questions, and that's only one of the many ways that, religion and the state are actually quite intertwined.
I actually attended, for a story, a libertarian church that refused to become a nonprofit because they didn't want to be part of that larger system. Long story. Okay. Our next question is something that intersects so directly with your work. And we got, I think, like 10 questions in this vein, which I think is speaks to how frustrated so many people are right now with the actions of our federal government. So this question comes from Katie.
How can we think about taxes in the age of fascism? I've always been happy to pay my taxes. I think the services they pay for are important, and I want to contribute to a healthy society. I've had disagreements with how taxes are allocated. The Department of Defense does not need that much money. But given the funding allocation to ICE in 2025 and the ways in which appropriated funds are being moved around or left unused, what is a rule follower to do? I've seen talk about not paying federal taxes. Is this really an option? How can we register our disgust and disapproval through withholding our money from the feds?
So I think that people maybe there have been tax protesters for a very long time. And someone actually wrote in about their professor who was a tax protester during, I believe, the Gulf War. And it also speaks to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation about how there is a lot of compulsion and fear around the idea of not paying taxes and what would happen to you. But we don't have debtors' prisons anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay, so tax as a means of protest. Where do you start here? You have so many thoughts, I know.
Oh, I have so many thoughts. And I just want people to read the book so that they can really get into the weeds on some of the stories of folks who've been doing this work. But I'll just say that we sometimes associate tax protests primarily with the right and with radical libertarians who don't believe in taxation as an institution, don't believe the state should exist or have that power. But really, one of the most kind of vibrant traditions of tax resistance in the United States comes from the left, and it comes from the peace movement. And people who are not so much concerned about taxation in general, who actually would love to be able to pay their taxes, who often support the idea of taxation as a form of kind of sharing and mutual aid, but who, for religious or moral reasons, believe that they cannot in good conscience pay taxes if they are contributing to war or contributing to particular kinds of war. And so since World War II, and really even earlier, if you look at, smaller historic peace churches like the Quakers, there have been Americans who refuse to pay taxes that contribute to war. And so when Katie asks, is this an option? It's not a legal option, I should note. Yeah. And so I often do remind people that, this is not legal, but it is for many people. And there's a whole community of peace activists who have been doing war tax resistance for generations, who organize in order to do this as a form of civil disobedience, or as what they would often think of as a form of conscientious objection to war. And so I can talk a little bit more about what that looks like and the different flavors of that. But yes, it is something that people think a lot about. And I should say that some folks in the anti-abortion movement also did this kind of tax resistance for a time right after Roe v. Wade was passed. And then they basically didn't have to after that because lawmakers created a set of provisions in the budget, often associated with the Hyde Amendment and things like this, that said that actually your tax dollars can't be used to pay for abortion. But no such provision was ever made to say your tax dollars won't be used to pay for war. And so the peace movement, continued in this effort.
But I do think that this, the idea, what's a rule follower to do? I do things that are illegal all the time. And I don't mean that to sound like a badass. I speed all the time. I drank before it was legal. I used marijuana before it was legal. There are things that we decide match our moral codes, but not the legal code.
Yeah.
And so, but sometimes the legal code is our moral code. How do you think about that the difference there and how people can discern that.
Yeah, no, I think that, and one of the things I loved about talking, I talked to a lot of war tax resistors and read a lot of their memoirs and spent a lot of time in their spaces. And, one of the really fascinating things was the amount of discernment that they were doing around this question, because they were thinking about things like, I really love for my tax dollars to pay for Medicaid and Social Security and the roads and X and Y and Z. But like, I viscerally cannot allow my money to pay for a bullet in a war that could shoot a child. And they would have these really visceral ways of imagining their specific dollar being transformed into a weapon of war that would kill a specific person. And so, that to them was just completely morally untenable. And so they figured out, how do I try and do both, right? And they come up with lots of creative strategies. And so, one of them is just complete non-payment of their taxes, where, it's an act of protest, and the goal is to send a message to government that would hopefully force them to end that immoral war, so that this wasn't a moral problem anymore. They've never really gotten enough scale to have that impact, but that would be the dream, right? Some of them do more kind of symbolic gestures, where they refuse to pay the proportion of their taxes that, is allocated to defense. With the idea that, well, I'm paying the half that's going to life-affirming kind of services that the government provides. Some of them do a kind of token non-payment as a form of protest that sort of makes them feel like, they're bearing moral witness to the problems that they see in terms of the budget. And then many of them, when they talk about doing tax resistance, they pair it with what they call redirection. And so they say, I'm a war tax resistor and redirector. And they say, what would I have paid in taxes if I had paid my taxes in full? They actually calculate it to the penny. They tend to actually submit tax returns that are, honest and clear, and then they just don't pay everything they owe. So it's a very public form of protest and resistance. And then they will often include an itemized list of how they donated that money that they didn't pay to organizations that also helped them to kind of put their money where their values are. And so, it really helped me to see that there's a plurality of ways that people can, imagine their money is contributing to either morally bad things or morally good things. And so much of what people who think a lot about this are doing is trying to discern how they can do that most effectively.
I love that answer. We'll put a lot of links in the show notes for people to check out some examples. Our last question is going to serve as the AAA question for this week. AAA is Ask Ann Anything, but today it's Ask Ruth Anything. It's about talking about taxes when there are major differences in attitude. And as always, this is just for paid subscribers. So if you want to be sure you always get the full ad-free episode, head to patreon.com/culturestudy and sign up. Ruth, where can people find you if they want to hear more from you?
So you can read my book, My Tax Dollars, The Morality of Tax Paying in America, where there are so many stories of people who feel passionately about this issue and try to put that into practice in some way. Some of those you'll probably agree with. Some of those you'll probably be horrified by. But, I think that they all sort of paint a really complicated picture that I hope is fun to read. I'm also on Substack, where I write a weekly newsletter called Democracy is Hard, where I also get into a lot of these issues. And I have a documentary podcast out that came out around the same time as the book called When the Wolves Came, Evangelicals Resisting Extremism. So you can find me in any of those places.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, because we have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise you don't want to miss any of them. If you want to suggest a topic, ask a question about the culture that surrounds you, or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod, or check the show notes for a link. And if you want to support the show and get bonus content, head to patreon.com/culturestudy. It's $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, an exclusive advice time segment, and weekly discussion threads for each episode. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.